Mara Bennett took the empty seat beside me on the last train out of downtown, crossed one leg over the other, and said, "Missed me?" As if 8 years were a scheduling problem. I had just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency department, my coffee had gone cold before midnight, and 3 different people had mistaken me for someone emotionally equipped to solve their lives. None of that prepared me for seeing her. Mara looked older in the ways that mattered, and almost exactly the same in the ways that didn't. Dark hair tucked behind one ear, sharp brown eyes, and a smile that usually arrived half a second before trouble. My name is Daniel Hart. I was 32, working nights as a charge nurse at Lakeshore Medical Center, and I had taken the same final commuter train home often enough to know which doors opened closest to the stairs at my stop. My routine was efficient, quiet, and almost impossible to interrupt. Mara had always been talented at interruptions. She had also been the closest thing I ever had to a great love story, despite the inconvenient fact that neither of us had admitted we were in one. I looked at her for longer than politeness allowed, then said, "I assumed you were dead." She nodded thoughtfully. "Good. I was worried you'd become dramatic." The laugh escaped me before I could stop it, and Mara's smile changed. The confidence remained, but something beneath it softened, as if hearing me laugh had answered a question she had not asked aloud. She told me she was back in Chicago to finish editing a documentary about neighborhood theaters that had survived redevelopment. Her team had 18 days left before the final cut was due. I asked whether 18 days meant she had already booked the flight out, and she pretended to study the route map above the windows. "That is an aggressively unfriendly second question," she said. "You opened with an obituary. You disappeared. I moved. You moved to another continent and stopped answering messages. That qualifies as advanced disappearing." Mara turned toward me fully. The train was nearly empty, with only a sleeping man near the doors and 2 college students sharing earbuds several rows ahead. Outside, the city slipped past in dark windows and scattered lights. "I answered some messages," she said. I reminded her that sending a photograph of a Lisbon rooftop 6 months after leaving did not count as a conversation. She winced, but instead of hiding behind another joke, she said, "You're right." That simple admission unsettled me more than an argument would have. In college, Mara could turn any uncomfortable subject into a performance until everyone forgot what had been asked. She was brilliant at making departure look like momentum. I had watched her leave parties, jobs, apartments, and eventually Chicago before anyone could ask whether she was running toward something or away from it. Back then, I had mistaken that restlessness for certainty. Sitting beside her now, I could see that some of it had been fear wearing better clothes. She asked about the hospital, and I gave her the compact version. Too many overnight shifts, too much vending machine food, and a new educator position I kept pretending I had not considered. Mara knew immediately that pretending meant I wanted it. She always had an annoying talent for hearing the part of my answer I left out. "You'd be good at teaching," she said. "You explain terrifying things without making people feel stupid." I told her that sounded like a highly specific compliment. "It is," she replied. "I've had 8 years to improve it." The train announced her station, but Mara stayed seated. I glanced toward the doors as they opened, and she kept looking at me as though she had made a decision. The doors closed again. "You missed your stop," I said. I noticed. That seems careless for someone who travels professionally. Maybe I wanted more than 6 minutes. The line was delivered lightly, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. We got off at the next station because the final train did not reverse for another hour, and Mara's hotel was now a 20-minute walk away. The air outside had the first real cold of autumn, sharp enough to wake me after the stale warmth of the train. She walked beside me with her hands in the pockets of a long brown coat, occasionally bumping her shoulder against mine the way she used to when she wanted attention without asking for it. Chicago after midnight had always made ordinary conversations feel private. Stores were dark, traffic had thinned, and the train tracks rattled above us like something following at a respectful distance. Mara told me the project had brought her back sooner than expected. I asked whether coming home felt strange, and she said Chicago had never stopped feeling like home, which made leaving it repeatedly more complicated than she liked to admit. Before I could ask what that meant for the 18th day, she stopped beneath the yellow light of a closed pharmacy. "We're going to ruin this if we try to explain 8 years in one walk," she said. I told her there was no this yet to ruin. Mara smiled at the lie, then proposed a rule. Whenever our schedules put us on the last train together, each of us could ask one question. The other person had to answer honestly before the next stop. No jokes instead of answers, no changing the subject, and no using the past as an excuse to lie about the present. She called it one stop, one truth. I should have refused. 18 days was exactly the kind of deadline sensible people did not build emotional experiments around. Mara had appeared without warning, admitted nothing about whether she was staying, and already made me miss the quiet life I had 5 minutes before she sat down. Instead, I agreed because some part of me had spent 8 years wanting answers more than peace. We reached her hotel just after 1 in the morning. Mara stood beneath the awning while a light rain began tapping against the pavement. She looked at me with the same fearless expression she had worn before presentations in college, except now I knew courage and certainty were not the same thing. "The rule starts tonight," she said. I reminded her we were no longer on the train. Technicality. "You invented the rule 30 seconds ago, then I understand it better than anyone." She stepped closer, not enough to touch me, but enough that I caught the clean citrus scent of her shampoo beneath the cold air. "Did you know I was in love with you?" she asked. The question removed every prepared answer from my head. Before I could decide whether honesty required cruelty, hope, or both, the station clock across the street struck 1:15. Mara watched my face and gave me a small, nervous smile. "Your stop," she said, though we both knew it wasn't. Then she went inside, leaving me beneath the hotel awning with rain darkening my jacket and the first truth of our reunion waiting for the next train. I spent the next day pretending Mara's question had not followed me into every room of the hospital. It sat beside me during morning handoff, waited through a trauma consult, and appeared again whenever my phone lit up without her name on it. By 9 that evening, I had constructed several answers that were technically honest and emotionally useless. At 11:43, a message finally arrived from Mara. "Same train, same seat. You still owe me one truth." She was waiting near the center doors when I boarded, holding 2 paper cups and wearing a dark green sweater beneath her coat. Mara handed me one without asking whether I still took coffee black. "Bribery does not change the rules," I said. "It isn't bribery. It's support for a struggling participant." I sat beside her, and the train pulled away before either of us mentioned the question she had left me with. Our first stop passed while she stared through the window, giving me the silence she rarely offered anyone. "I knew," I said before the next station announcement. Mara turned slowly. I explained that I had suspected she loved me, but suspicion had never felt like permission to build a future around it. In college, every plan she described involved another city, another country, or a life too large to remain still. I had believed that asking her to stay would make me the cautious man standing between her and everything she wanted. "So you decided for me," she said. The words were not angry, but they carried more disappointment than I expected. I told her I had decided not to become a reason she resented Chicago. Mara looked down at her coffee. "I spent 2 years trying to make it obvious." I reminded her that her version of obvious included stealing my fries, falling asleep on my shoulder during movies, and once telling me she would marry me if we were both single at 40. That was practically a proposal. "You said 40 was too young to panic." She smiled despite herself, then added that every time she tried to create a moment between us, I turned it into a joke or something safe. I had thought safety was kindness. To her, it had sounded like rejection. Our rule continued over the next several nights. Sometimes Mara asked questions first, and sometimes I did, but neither of us treated the game casually again. She admitted that she had followed my hospital career through mutual friends long after we stopped speaking. I admitted I had watched every documentary carrying her name in the credits, though I usually waited several months so it would not feel pathetic. She asked why my longest relationship after college had ended, and I told her the truth. The woman wanted a life I kept saying I would eventually make room for, until eventually stopped sounding believable. I asked whether Mara had ever come close to staying anywhere. She told me about a director in London who had proposed after 11 months and about the panic she felt when everyone around them called it romantic. "He loved the version of me who arrived with one suitcase," she said. "He didn't understand why I couldn't promise to become someone who unpacked forever." The answer should have confirmed every fear I had about her, but it did the opposite. She was not proud of leaving. She simply did not know how to remain without feeling trapped. Mara began waiting near my usual train car, even on evenings when her editing session ended early. Once, I saw her across the platform 20 minutes before departure, sitting on a bench with her laptop closed beside her. She claimed the earlier train had smelled suspicious, and I told her she was a terrible liar. "That isn't one of your official questions," she replied. "Then I'll save it." Her smile told me she wanted me to. One night, a man near the doors began breathing too quickly and clutching the front of his jacket. I recognized the signs of a panic attack before the conductor reached us. I crouched beside him, spoke quietly, and guided his breathing until his hands stopped shaking. Mara stayed back, kept the other passengers from crowding him, and handed me a bottle of water without needing instructions. When the man left at the next station, embarrassed but steady, Mara watched me return to my seat with an expression I could not read. "What?" I asked. She said, "You're exactly the same." I told her that was not particularly flattering after 8 years. "Not the same," she corrected. "More yourself." She explained that in college I had always noticed when someone needed help before anyone else did, but I used to look surprised whenever people trusted me. Now I carried that trust without making it about myself. I did not know what to do with a compliment that specific, so I looked out the window and pretended the passing warehouse lights required concentration. The train stopped unexpectedly 2 stations later because of a signal problem. After 20 minutes, the conductor announced that service might not resume soon, so Mara and I left through the nearest station and found a small noodle shop still open beneath the tracks. It was the first time we had sat across from each other in full light since her return. Without train windows reflecting us back or station announcements limiting our answers, the evening felt less like a reunion and more like a first date. Neither of us had admitted arranging. We ate noodles at a narrow counter, while Mara told me about editing footage in rooms where she did not speak the language and learning to understand emotion through silence, posture, and timing. I told her that sounded useful for someone who avoided direct conversations. She pointed her chopsticks at me and said my nursing career had made me dangerously confident. "No," I said. "You always made me confident, mostly because arguing with you required preparation." She laughed, and the sound drew a glance from the cook. When we returned to the station, the trains were moving again. Mara stood close beside me on the platform, her shoulder resting against my arm without either of us acknowledging it. Our train arrived, and we took the same 2 seats. Before my stop, I used my question. "Why did you disappear completely?" Mara's body went still, though her face remained turned toward the window. I told her she could say she regretted it, feared the distance, or simply stopped caring, but I needed the real answer. She finally looked at me. The confidence was gone, leaving something more open and much harder to dismiss. "Because staying in touch with you hurt more than losing everyone else," she said. Then the train announced the next station, and Mara shook her head. "That's true, but it isn't the whole answer." Her fingers closed around mine for one brief second before she released them. "The rest will take more than one stop." Mara did not explain the rest the next night. She boarded our usual train, sat beside me, and asked whether I had eaten dinner, which was how I knew she was avoiding the subject. I let her do it for 3 stops. Then I reminded her that 1 stop, 1 truth did not include carrying half an answer across an entire week. She looked down at our hands resting inches apart on the seat and said, "I know, I'm trying to tell it without making it sound like your fault." The year we graduated, Mara had been offered a 12-month editing fellowship in Lisbon. I remembered the announcement because she had arrived at our favorite campus bar, waving the acceptance email over her head while everyone cheered. She had looked incandescent, as though the life she always described had finally opened a door. What I did not know was that she had delayed accepting for 6 days because she was waiting for me to say something that would make leaving difficult. "I wasn't waiting for you to ask me to give it up," she said. "I wanted to know whether leaving meant losing something real." I asked why she never told me that. Mara gave me a tired smile. "Because I was 23 and thought making myself impossible to lose was more romantic than admitting I wanted to be chosen." During those 6 days, she had invited me to dinner twice, asked whether I could ever imagine living somewhere else, and mentioned that the fellowship allowed deferred entry. I had answered every question practically. I told her the opportunity was too good to risk, that she would regret staying, and that Chicago would still be here when she came back. I remembered those conversations differently, which was the worst part. In my version, I had been supportive. In hers, I had made it clear that her leaving would not cost me anything. "You hugged me at the airport and told me to go become famous," she said. "You looked proud. You didn't look heartbroken." I told her I had been heartbroken, but I believed showing it would have been selfish. She shook her head. "You keep calling silence kindness, Daniel. Sometimes silence just lets the other person be wrong alone." The train slowed between stations, then stopped completely. The overhead lights flickered once before stabilizing, and the conductor announced a mechanical delay. Around us, the few remaining passengers sighed and reached for their phones. Mara leaned back against the seat, staring at the black window where our reflections hovered over the dark tunnel. There would be no next stop to rescue either of us from the conversation. I told her I had planned to confess before she left. The night of her farewell party, I had carried a folded note in my jacket because speaking plainly felt impossible once everyone gathered around us. Then I overheard her tell a friend that Chicago had become too small and that leaving felt like finally breathing again. I went home with the note still in my pocket. "You weren't talking about me," I said, "but I thought you were talking about everything that included me." Mara closed her eyes. She explained that she had been talking about her family, debt, and the panic of becoming the person everyone expected her to be. She had not meant me, but she had also never corrected the assumption because she did not know I had made it. Once she reached Lisbon, every conversation with me became proof that I could continue without her. I sent friendly messages about the hospital, mutual friends, and weather. She answered less often because polite friendship felt like being asked to stand beside the life she wanted and pretend she had never wanted it. "So you vanished," I said. Mara nodded. "I did something cruel because I didn't know how to do something honest." She did not blame travel, timing, or youth. She admitted that cutting contact gave her control over a rejection I had never actually delivered. Then she looked at me and said, "I'm sorry," not in a nostalgic "we were kids" way. "I hurt you because leaving first felt safer." The apology mattered, but it did not erase the years when I wondered whether our friendship had meant less to her than it had to me. I told her that. I also admitted I had used her silence as proof that my caution was justified, which allowed me to avoid examining how often I waited for certainty before taking any emotional risk. We had both protected ourselves with decisions made on the other person's behalf. Mara left because she assumed I did not want her, and I stayed silent because I assumed wanting her would become a burden. The train remained motionless. Somewhere farther down the car, one of the college students laughed at something on his phone, and the ordinary sound made the space between Mara and me feel even more private. She turned toward me until one knee touched mine. "The rule says one question," she said. "I'm asking another." I told her that sounded like corruption of a carefully designed system. "You agreed to a system I invented on a sidewalk. Standards were already low." Her smile faded before she asked, "Do you want to kiss the woman I am now, or are you still trying to fix what we missed?" The question deserved more than nostalgia, so I looked at her as she was. 31, tired from editing until midnight, braver in some ways and less certain in others, no longer the college girl who treated departure like a personality. I wanted her sharpness, her restlessness, her willingness to return and sit beside someone she had hurt. I wanted the present complication, not a repaired version of the past. I reached for her slowly enough that she could change her mind. Mara's hand came to the side of my neck, and when I kissed her, there was nothing tentative about the way she answered. 8 years of imagined versions disappeared under the reality of her mouth, the warmth of her body turning toward mine, and the quiet sound she made when my fingers slipped into her hair. The kiss did not feel like recovering something lost. It felt like choosing something that had never existed this way before. The train lurched forward without warning, and Mara caught my shoulder as we both laughed against each other. When we separated, she kept her forehead close to mine. "That was inconveniently good," she whispered. I told her the transit authority would be pleased to learn delays improved passenger satisfaction. She kissed me once more, shorter this time, then looked down at our joined hands with an expression that held happiness and fear in equal measure. "There's something else," she said. My first instinct was to joke that she had exhausted the truth allowance for the evening, but her grip tightened before I could. The documentary studio had offered her a permanent senior editing position in Chicago. It came with creative authority, a real team, and work that would not end every few months with another packed suitcase. She had 5 days to accept or decline. The train announced her station. This time, Mara stood, but she did not release my hand until the doors opened. "I haven't decided," she said, "and I don't want you pretending that doesn't matter." Then she stepped onto the platform, leaving me with the taste of her kiss and the knowledge that our second chance had finally become real at exactly the moment it acquired an expiration date. Mara's job offer changed the temperature of every train ride that followed. We still sat in the same seats, still traded coffee, still used dry humor whenever the truth became too sharp, but the 5-day deadline traveled with us like a third passenger. After our kiss, touching became easier and conversation became harder. Mara would rest her hand on mine between stops, then ask whether I thought Chicago could ever feel permanent to someone who had spent a decade leaving it. I refused to answer the question the way she wanted. I told her the studio position sounded excellent, that creative authority was rare, and that she should judge it by the work rather than by me. All of that was true, but Mara heard the part I was avoiding. "You're doing it again," she said on the second night after the offer. "You're making yourself irrelevant before I can choose whether you matter." I said I did not want her waking up 2 years from now believing she had changed her life for a relationship that might not survive. Mara pulled her hand away and looked at me with restrained disbelief. "I didn't ask you to choose my job," she said. "I asked whether you want a place in the decision." I told her I wanted her, but wanting her did not give me the right to influence where she built her career. She shook her head and said, "Every relationship influences a life. Pretending otherwise doesn't make you noble. It just means I have to guess what you actually feel." The train doors opened at the next station, but neither of us moved. Mara said she was tired of being treated like any desire to stay must be temporary, impulsive, or secretly dependent on someone else. I reminded her that she still described every city as a place she might leave as soon as the work changed. "Because that has been my life," she answered. "You keep asking for proof that I'll never leave before you'll let yourself begin." I said I was asking for evidence that I would not become another project she loved intensely until the deadline passed. The words hurt her, and I knew it before she turned toward the window. Mara did not accuse me of being cruel, which made the silence worse. After a long moment, she said, "You don't get to call me temporary every time you're scared." I told her she did not get to act as though leaving first was simply part of her personality. We sat beside each other through 2 stops without touching, both of us angry because neither accusation was entirely false. That night, after she left the train, I walked home instead of taking the bus from my station. The educator position at Lakeshore had been open for nearly a month, and I had avoided applying because night shifts were familiar. I told myself the schedule suited me, that I was useful where I was, and that changing roles would mean losing the part of nursing I understood best. The truth was less flattering. I had built a life where exhaustion, excused distance, and routine protected me from having to decide what I wanted next. I submitted the application at 2 in the morning. The position would move me into daytime clinical education, training new nurses, and designing emergency response simulations. It was not a romantic gesture, and I did not tell Mara immediately because I did not want my choice to become leverage against hers. I applied because I was tired of demanding courage from someone whose life looked less stable than mine while refusing to disturb my own carefully defended routine. Mara spent the following afternoon with Elena Ruiz, her producer, reviewing the Chicago offer. Elena did not appear in our story as a wise friend sent to explain Mara to herself. She simply asked practical questions Mara had been avoiding, whether the studio respected her judgment, whether the work challenged her, and whether she wanted a home base even if she continued traveling for projects. Later, Mara told me that Elena had said staying in one city did not mean becoming a smaller person. It meant choosing where she wanted to return. Our most difficult conversation came on the 4th night, when only 24 hours remained before Mara's decision was due. She sat beside me, but kept her coat buttoned and her bag on her lap, as though she might leave at any station. I told her about applying for the educator position before she could use our rule to force the admission out of me. Mara's expression softened, then tightened again when she realized I had made the decision without mentioning it. "I'm glad you applied," she said, "but don't show me your brave choice and expect it to answer mine." I told her I did not. I also said I would not ask her to accept the Chicago job for me because I wanted whatever happened between us to survive honest career choices rather than depend on sacrifice disguised as romance. Mara asked what I was willing to ask for, then, if not that. I took her hand and made myself answer without hiding behind fairness. I'm asking you to stop treating departure like the only honest ending, I said. I'm asking you to stay in the conversation when it gets uncomfortable instead of deciding I'll disappoint you and leaving before I can. Mara's fingers tightened around mine. I told her that if she accepted the job, I wanted the chance to build something real with her, and if she declined it for reasons that belonged to her, I still wanted honesty instead of another disappearance. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I'm asking you to stop loving me like I'm already halfway gone. That was fair, so I promised to try. Not perfectly and not without fear, but without pretending distance was inevitable. Mara leaned against my shoulder, and for the rest of the ride, we said almost nothing. The silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like two people finally allowing a decision to remain difficult without running from each other. At her stop, Mara stood and adjusted the strap of her bag. I asked whether she had made her choice, but she said she would not tell me yet. Tomorrow is my final night on the project, she said. Meet me on the last train. Same car, same seats. Before the doors opened, she touched my face and added, one final question each. Before the end of the line, no unfinished answers. Then she stepped onto the platform, leaving me to watch the doors close between us. For the first time since she returned, I did not know whether the next train would mark the beginning of her life in Chicago or the final ride before she left it again. Mara was already in our usual seat when I boarded the final train on the last night of her project. She wore the same brown coat from the night she first returned, but this time there was no coffee in her hand and no playful performance waiting to protect either of us. Her laptop bag rested at her feet, and the seat beside her was empty as though she had been guarding it. When I sat down, she looked at me and said, "You came." I told her that after 18 nights, missing the last one would have been a strange time to become unpredictable. The train pulled away from downtown, carrying us through the same dark windows and station lights that had held nearly every important conversation since her return. Neither of us rushed to use the rule. Mara slipped her hand into mine, and we rode through the first stop in silence. It was not the comfortable silence from college or the defensive silence from the week before. It felt like the pause before two people signed their names beneath something they had already read carefully. At the second stop, I asked my final question. Do you want Chicago, or do you want to repair what happened between us? Mara watched the platform slide away, then said she had accepted the senior editing position that afternoon. The job gave her creative authority, a permanent team, and the chance to build documentaries that required more than arriving, fixing a project, and disappearing when the credits rolled. She had chosen it because the work made sense for the person she had become, not because I had kissed her on a stalled train. Relief moved through me so quickly that I almost interrupted, but Mara tightened her hand around mine and kept speaking. She said I mattered to the decision because a life could not be divided into clean categories where work remained untouched by love and love asked nothing of work. Still, she had not chosen Chicago as a sacrifice or proof of devotion. She wanted a home base and a city she could leave for assignments without treating every departure as an escape. I want to come back somewhere, she said. And yes, I want you to be part of what I come back to. The answer gave me hope, but Mara had made a decision about her life, and I still had to make one about us. When the train reached the next station, she turned toward me and asked her final question. Can you love me without requiring proof that I'll never change, travel, or make a choice you don't understand? I looked at the woman beside me instead of the college version I had carried for 8 years. Mara would still accept assignments in unfamiliar cities and become restless when work stopped challenging her. Loving her could not mean converting her into someone who stayed still enough to make me comfortable. It meant trusting that movement was not always abandonment and telling her, when fear made me interpret it that way, I can't promise I'll never be afraid you're leaving, I said, but I can promise I won't treat fear like evidence. I'll ask instead of deciding for you, and I'll tell you what I want before silence turns into another answer neither of us meant. Mara's eyes shone, but she smiled with enough mischief to keep the moment ours. That was almost emotionally competent. I told her the hospital educator interview had clearly improved me. I had received the offer that morning and accepted it. In 3 weeks, I would leave permanent night shifts and begin training new emergency nurses during the day. I explained that I had not changed jobs to become easier for her to date. I had done it because the life I defended as stable had really become a place where nothing new could ask much of me. Mara lifted my hand and pressed her lips to my knuckles. "Look at us," she said. "Two people making independent decisions and still ruining each other's emotional composure." Her station announcement sounded overhead. The doors opened, and for a moment we both looked toward the platform where she had stepped off every other night. Mara stayed seated. The doors closed, and the train continued toward my stop. When mine arrived, I did the same. We rode past both familiar exits and remained beside each other until there were no ordinary stops left to hide behind. At the terminus, the conductor reminded us that the train was out of service. We stepped onto an almost empty platform beneath harsh fluorescent lights, nowhere near the romantic ending either of us might have imagined in college. Mara laughed at the setting, and I told her it suited us because we had already wasted enough time waiting for perfect moments. Then I asked whether she wanted a real relationship with me, one that existed in daylight, survived separate work trips, and required more honesty than one question per station. She stepped close and placed both hands inside my coat. "Yes," she said, "but I'm keeping the rule." I asked whether that meant interrogations on public transit forever. "No. It means if one of us asks the honest question, the other person doesn't disappear before answering." That was a rule I could live with. I kissed her at the end of the line while the conductor walked past us, shaking his head. The following weeks were less cinematic and more convincing. Mara moved into a permanent editing suite, while I traded overnight exhaustion for classrooms full of nervous new nurses. She traveled to Toronto for 4 days and called me from the airport before I had time to invent a story about why her silence mattered. I told her I missed her without making it an accusation. She came back with bad coffee, an overpacked suitcase, and the ordinary confidence of someone who expected to return. A month after our final night ride, we boarded a train on a bright Saturday morning. The car was crowded with families, shopping bags, and sunlight, strong enough to erase our reflections from the windows. Mara sat beside me, rested her head on my shoulder, and asked whether I missed the secrecy of our midnight conversations. I said no, then admitted I missed having her trapped beside me until the next stop. She laughed and stayed there anyway. For years, I thought Mara and I had missed our chance because the timing was wrong. The truth was that timing had only exposed what neither of us knew how to do: ask clearly, answer honestly, and remain present when the answer carried risk. The last train gave us a place to practice, but choosing each other began when we stopped treating the end of the line like the end of the story.
I need to talk about Daniel and Mara because these two managed to lose 8 entire years over a misunderstanding that probably could have been cleared up with one honest conversation. Mara just sits down beside him on the last train and says, "Missed me?" Like she didn't move to another continent, barely answer his messages, and leave him wondering whether their friendship ever meant as much to her as it did to him. That entrance was bold, I'll give her that, but I also wanted Daniel to make her work a little harder for the reunion. You don't disappear for 8 years and come back acting like you were gone for a long weekend. At the same time, Daniel wasn't innocent either. The more they talked, the more obvious it became that both of them had spent years making decisions for the other person without ever asking what they actually wanted. Mara assumed Daniel didn't care enough to ask her to stay, while Daniel assumed asking her to stay would make him the selfish guy standing in the way of her future. And that sounds considerate until you realize it gave Mara absolutely no chance to choose for herself. I really liked their one stop, one truth rule because it forced them to finally say the things they had avoided when they were younger. It also felt believable that they needed several train rides to get through everything. You're not going to fix 8 years of hurt in one conversation, especially when both people are still trying to protect themselves. But Daniel frustrated me because every time Mara gave him an opening, he gave her the safest answer possible. This man had apparently been in love with her for years, watched every documentary she worked on, followed her career through mutual friends, and still kept acting like admitting he wanted her would somehow ruin her life. Meanwhile, Mara wasn't exactly great at communicating either. She thought stealing his fries, sleeping on his shoulder, and joking about marrying him at 40 counted as a clear confession. No, Mara. Those are clues. That is not a conversation. Then when she left for Lisbon, she cut him off because staying in touch hurt too much. I understand why she did it emotionally, but it was still cruel. She gave herself control by disappearing before Daniel could officially reject her, except he had never actually rejected her. She was reacting to an answer he never gave. What did you think about that part? Do you blame Mara more for disappearing, or Daniel for being so careful that she believed he didn't want her? Let me know in the comments, because I honestly think they were equally responsible, just in completely different ways. The stalled train kiss worked for me because Daniel finally stopped treating Mara like the college girl he had lost and looked at the person sitting beside him now. He wasn't kissing her to recreate the past. He actually wanted the woman she had become, including the complicated parts. But of course, the second they finally kiss, there's a job decision waiting to cause another problem. Mara gets offered a permanent position in Chicago, and Daniel immediately starts doing the same thing again. He tells her to judge the job based on the work and not on him, which sounds mature, but Mara sees right through it. She wasn't asking him to decide for her. She was asking whether he wanted to be included in the life she was deciding to build. That's a big difference. Daniel kept removing himself from her choices before she could decide whether he mattered, and honestly, I understood why that made her angry, but I also understood his fear. Mara had spent most of her adult life moving from city to city and project to project. Daniel didn't want to become another intense experience she loved until the next deadline arrived. His mistake was treating that fear like proof she would leave again. The argument where Mara tells him, "You don't get to call me temporary every time you're scared," was probably the moment I agreed with her the most. Daniel wanted a guarantee that she would never leave before he allowed himself to fully begin, and nobody can give that kind of guarantee. I was also glad the story gave Daniel his own decision to make, instead of making everything about whether Mara stayed. Applying for the hospital educator position showed that he had been hiding inside routine, just as much as Mara had been hiding inside movement. Mara kept leaving before anything could trap her, while Daniel stayed in the same place so nothing could disrupt him. They looked like opposites, but they were both avoiding risk. By the final train ride, they finally got it right. Mara accepted the Chicago position because she genuinely wanted the work, not because Daniel asked her to stay. Daniel accepted the educator role because he wanted a different life, not because he was changing himself to keep her. Then they chose the relationship on top of those decisions. That was the right ending for me. I would hated it if Mara suddenly rejected the job as some huge romantic sacrifice, because that would have repeated the same problem they had all along. One person deciding their future around what they assumed the other person needed. Instead, they finally said what they wanted and gave each other the chance to respond. So here's my question. Would you trust Mara after she disappeared once already? Or would you always be waiting for her to leave again? And if you were Mara, would Daniel's constant caution feel caring to you, or would it feel like rejection? Drop your opinion below, because I think this story really depends on which character you understand more. Personally, I like the ending because they didn't promise that Mara would stop traveling or that Daniel would never feel afraid. They only promised to ask the honest question and stay long enough to hear the answer. For these two, that's probably the most realistic promise they could make.